and bumblebees. It's sort of a love story. And I will feature some of the bumblebees that you may see in Southwest Oregon. This bumblebee right here is super lovely. It's called the two-form bumblebee, Bombus bifarius. It's relatively common in our region. And one thing I think is kind of distinctive is the middle part of the body, the thorax, where the wings are attached. There is this superhero shield that our other bumblebees don't really have. And so I always imagine it with a little cape coming out to heroically pollinate our beautiful wildflowers. So I am not an expert. I am a flower person who gets obsessed about certain topics. And I've been pretty obsessed about bumblebees the last, I don't know, 5, 7, 10 years. And it all started in 2nd grade, and I was on a softball team. And I was out in the outfield, and I don't remember attending to the games very closely. But I do remember seeing these gentle, fuzzy animals buzzing around, and not knowing any better, I would capture them and pet them. And I also didn't know that nature's warning symbol of saying yellow, black, stripy things, danger, danger. They might be poisonous. They might sting you. I didn't know that. And I certainly didn't know that in bumblebees, only the female bumblebees can sting and the males cannot. And the females are pretty gentle and often will not sting you if you treat them with respect. As a botanist, I peer at flowers, even when I'm driving on the freeway, you know, driving 80 miles per hour. And there's stories there beyond the flower themselves, all the visitors. And by the way, not all insects that visit flowers are pollinators. And if they are pollinators, they may not be the best pollinators, but all of them are special in one way or another. And you can find beauty, you can find intrigue, you can find love, and you can find death. What's going on here? So we have a crab spider, which is kind of a lurking predator that lives and eats in flowers. And this bumblebee is dead. Crab spiders are cool creatures, and they do scuttle around a bit like crabs. And they have this, oops, I don't even know which way I'm going. And they have this rather magical characteristic that they can change colors to match the flowers that they're in. Apparently it takes about 8 days or so for a crab spider to turn from a white color to a yellow color. I would say that most of what I know in any sort of true way of understanding bumblebees is because of this great man, Dr. Robin Thorpe, who passed away a few years ago. I took a number of workshops and classes with him, and he was a very dedicated conservationist and scientist. He was a bee taxonomist at UC Davis, and in his later years, really began to focus on bumblebees and also understanding the bees that visit vernal pool flowers in the Central Valley. And even after he retired, he worked very, very hard in education and science and bumblebees. And here he is actually showing that a kid's toy can actually be an effective way to collect safely bumblebees. I also learned quite a lot from Rich Hatfield, who is a bee specialist with the Xerces Society, and he runs their wonderful community science projects, Bumblebee Watch and Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas. And it's from his program that I hope you join Janine at Vesper Meadow and take a look at bumblebees using their protocol. Here he is on Mount Ashland photographing a bumblebee that is temporarily cold, so it's easy to take a photograph of. But it will warm up and fly away. All right, Dumbledore, one of my favorite not real people. a gentle and wise wizard. Interestingly, he is named after the Old English word for bumblebees. Later, humblebee was very common, especially in like the 1800s during the time of Darwin. And they were called humblebees not because of their personality trait of being humble, which perhaps they are, but because they hum. It was in 1910 that people more often started to call bumblebees, and it related to a book that the children's author Beatrix Potter wrote called The Tales of Mrs. Tittlemouse, in which she had problematic friend, a bumblebee, Babbity Bumblebee. And that seemed to be the tipping point. And now we tend to call them in English bumblebees. For whatever reason, in Great Britain, bumblebees is one word. And here, at least in the United States, maybe Canada, actually, I don't know, bumblebee is two words. So let's get that out of the way. Bumblebees. There are about 250 known species in the world, around 50 known in the United States and Canada, and our region, 15, but you can find more, like up to 20. But for an insect group, there's not that many species. They're not as daunting as, say, beetles to start learning as a novice. And I so encourage you to get to know our bumblebees. Some of them are pretty easy to identify. This bumblebee is the orange-belted bumblebee and has an orange abdomen at the very tip. Note, however, that colors on bumblebees, just like the color in my hair, can fade. I'm turning gray slowly. So the bright yellows and the bright reds and oranges can fade, so they don't quite show up as much. But bumblebees are specialists in the lands of the temperate world, in alpine areas, and in the Arctic. And Tibetan Plateau is where you find the most number of species. Our area, there's quite a lot of species too in the mountains of North America. They are extremely effective pollinators as a group of pollinators. In part, it's because they're fuzzy. Notice that this bumblebee has a lot of pollen on it. They're better at moving pollen around. The females also tend to have a high fidelity to one particular species. So they'll go from one plant to another, and more likely spread the pollen to another plant. They are fuzzy and big, so they can fly when it's cold in the Arctic, a cold morning up in the mountains. And even though they're cold-blooded, they can do this with their wings and their flight muscles to warm themselves up, and can visit our beautiful mountain flowers. They're big and strong and clever also. They're very good at opening complex and sturdy flowers like larkspur and lupin and our other pea family members. And they're just an incredible, important component of our flower communities. They're important pollinators for our native plants, but also agricultural plants like eggplant and blueberries and tomatoes. They are fabulous. So here's a bumblebee on lupin, and I know it is a female. So only the females collect pollen in these little baskets on their hind legs, the corbicula. The boys, no, they don't. The females are mostly collecting pollen to take back to the colony to feed the baby bumblebees, the larvae. Boys, they just sip nectar for themselves and don't work as hard as the female workers and the queen bumblebees. So the plants just want pollen moved from one plant of the same species to another, right? The ones that use insects or other animals for pollination. But the bumblebees, they're there for the pollen, which is very high in protein, and particularly in the pea family, like the lupin, protein content can be up to 30%. And they're there for the energy, the food from nectar in the flowers. I might add that white leaf manzanita is one of our most incredible wildlife plants for insects and birds and bears and humans. And I have a couple of stories right here. One is that they are very early bloomers and have a lot of food for bumblebees and hummingbirds. So when we migrating rufous hummingbirds are flying through town, this is a great source of food to fuel their trip, their adventure, their destiny. This is one of a kind of flower that can only be buzz pollinated. About 8% of the world's flowers can only be buzz pollinated. And in our region, the main buzz pollinator is the bumblebee, although there are a few other species. And in other parts of the world, the buzz pollinators are not bumblebees. But bumblebees go up to the flower, they buzz in a certain frequency, which is often the note of C. These plants have anthers, the male part of the flowers, that have essentially little holes in them. And the buzzing shakes out the pollen, kind of like a salt shaker. This bumblebee is on a beautiful mule's ear flower, which is in the sunflower family. And this family often has heads of flowers, of many flowers, and in this case, heads of two different kinds of flowers. The disc flowers are in the middle where the bumblebee is, but also those petal structures are a kind of flower too. So lots of nectar resources, a great place to land. And the sunflower family is particularly known for having really sweet, nutrient-rich nectar. Up to 50% of the nectar can be really excellent sugar. This flower is a buttercup, and it's yellow. And bees like yellow flowers and blue flowers and purple flowers. They do not see red, but they do see ultraviolet light, which we can't see. If we were a bee, if we were looking at this shiny buttercup, we would see a bullseye in the center of ultraviolet light. They can sense what we humans cannot. This picture also reminds me, because I can't stop being a botanist, of Linnaeus, the person who is responsible for how we name organisms, scientific names. He described flowers as little lords and little ladies on a floral bed. And buttercups in particular are full of male parts and female parts, a bunch in the center. But anyway, back to bumblebees. So there's also floral larceny going on sometimes. So bumblebees, different species have different lengths of tongues. There's ones with shorter tongues, with longer tongues. The long-tongued bumblebees can often get nectar from very complicated spurs for flowers. Short-tongued bumblebees can't access that nectar unless they cheat. So here's a picture of actually a bumblebee from Great Britain using its mandibles to make a hole in the spur full of nectar. And here's a picture of it using its little straw, its proboscis, to suck the nectar out. It's not going through the front of the flower and getting covered in pollen. It's not pollinating the flower. It's a nectar robber. And when you're out there, I suggest that you keep an eye out and look for this activity, or at least signs of it. You can often find bits on larkspurs and white-leaf manzanita. Well, here are two beautiful long-tongued bumblebees of our region, and they're extra large species relative to some of the other bumblebees, and I think really showy. On the left, we have the white-shouldered bumblebee. That shoulders are usually white, but sometimes they're yellow, and it has a bright yellow abdomen. And it's visiting a larkspur or delphinium flower that has a long tube where it accesses the nectar, versus this Nevada bumblebee it doesn't have to have long tubes to suck out the nectar. It can also use more shallow tubes. And the Nevada bumblebee on the thorax has a really cute black spot on the thorax surrounded by yellow, and quite a lot of yellow on the abdomen. Note this one for sure is a female. There are other ways to tell the difference between males and females, and I think you'll be finding out about that more if you join Janine out in the field for her bumblebee blitz. Okay, so as Janine said, many of our bumblebees, like most of our insect groups, are struggling. Over a third plus of bumblebee species are on the decline, and there's a few species that are already extinct. And why? Well, I think most of us know the reasons, but one of the number one reasons we're losing bumblebees and other bees is loss of habitat, loss of natural areas with their food resources, with places where they can nest and have colonies and where the queens can overwinter. Also, those habitats are fragmented. Bumblebees don't travel very far, unlike honeybees or some other bees, to get their floral resources. Some species can go up to 3 miles, but more often they go closer to home. Changes in agriculture are huge. Loss of hedgerows, monoculture crops without messy, weedy areas with flowers. Obviously, we're aware that the wide-scale use of pesticides in industry and agriculture are significant impact on our bumblebees. But also non-native species, the spread of non-native plants and non-native diseases are significant. This is a collection of 2 very rare bees of our region from Dr. Robin Thorpe, the Franklin's bumblebee and the Western bumblebee. So here's another look at them with illustrations from the Xerces Society. These illustrations are also in the Vesper Meadow book about bumblebees. Note that overall, for a bumblebee, when you're used to kind of seeing extra stripy bumblebees, they have very dark abdomens with white bits at the tips. Franklin's bumblebee, for all the bumblebees known in the world, hopefully has the most narrow distribution of being in the Klamath-Siskiyous, Southwest Oregon and Northwest California. Western bumblebee has a broader range in Western United States, mostly in mountains. Both of these species are not doing well. And they're in a subgroup of bumblebees, the subgroup bombus, that in the 1990s, many species began declining, including one of them, the rusty-patched bumblebee, is now listed as endangered. So what's going on? Here's a Franklin's bumblebee and a poppy. By the way, poppies don't have nectar, but they have great pollen resources for pollinators. So the story probably goes like this. This is Dr. Robin Thorpe's and other people's belief, is in the 1980s in Europe, I think in the Netherlands, a new industry was started in which they were creating bumblebees hives and selling them for hothouses, for greenhouses, for tomatoes. And it was very successful. Tomatoes need either human intervention or bumblebees to pollinate and set fruit. In the early 1990s, businesses, farmers started bringing native bumblebees to the United States that had been shipped to Europe and then bred, and then their colonies brought back, especially for greenhouses, to the United States. Meanwhile, Dr. Robin Thorpe had been doing extensive bumblebee surveys in Southwest Oregon and started to notice a decline in the 1990s, particularly around 1995 or so. And particularly of the Franklin's bumblebee and the Western bumblebee, they were blinking out. And the hypothesis is non-native diseases, perhaps a fungus, from Europe, or just from rearing and having bumblebees, commercial bumblebees close together, perhaps from the honeybee pollen that they're fed in these production facilities, hit one particular group of bumblebees very hard. Unfortunately, the last time the Franklin's bumblebee was seen, and again, this is a bumblebee that was common in Ashland and Selma, common in the Klamath-Siskiyous. The last time I was seen 6 on Mount Ashland, up off of Road 20 in those beautiful wet meadows full of flowers. And one has not been seen since. There's been many investigations by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, by agencies, by the Xerces societies, by researchers. And so far, none have been found. And we're just hoping and praying that there are out there at very low numbers and that they will recover from whatever hit them. Here's pictures of the Western bumblebee by Pepper Trail, our local amazing scientist. He actually he volunteers with the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas and does surveys in Eastern Oregon. And the good news with this bumblebee is, although very few sightings are still seen west of the Cascades, they are more commonly seen east of the Cascades. So they may be recovering. And almost close to conclusion, I just wanted to feature really common bumblebee, actually a bumblebee that might be increasing or adaptable to urbanization and agriculture. And this is the beautiful, extra tidy, yellow-faced bumblebee, Bombus Siskiyou. Note that it has an extra tidy look to it. There is a little yellow near the end of the abdomen, and that location is important in distinguishing it from another bumblebee, the Van Dyke's bumblebee. It has a really black belly or abdomen, but interestingly, it's very common. However, I did discover from Rich Hatfield that it's especially common around Ashland and the town of Leavenworth, Washington, in the Cascade Mountains. And so that's a perplexing thing. And I'm sure more data from the Xerces Society and the Oregon Bee Atlas through Oregon State University will continue to maybe figure that out. But a beautiful common bumblebee, and likely one that's in your garden. I do want to mention there is this great chart from the Xerces Society, but it's also available in the Vesper Meadow Bumblebee book that highlights most of the bumblebees that you could find in the Pacific Northwest. I want you to note, though, these are females. Males can be much more variable. And even within these groups, there still can be variability. They can have different colors on their hairs. And bee taxonomists tend to look at genitalia and faces more carefully, but people like you and me, we can identify most bumblebees too. And lastly, just please hang out with flowers, watch them, find solace, and help us continue to conserve important wildlife and pollinator habitat. This is actually the City of Ashland and Paratrist property, which we hope will be conserved. It's an amazing grassland with great resources for all kinds of organisms, including bumblebees. And I thank you. That's my presentation.
Okay, I'm going to say that all over again. Thank you, Kristi. That was amazing. I always love hearing about your enthusiasm for all the creatures. And feel free to write questions in the chat now or throughout the rest of this evening's presentation, and we'll try to field them at the very end. So for right now, I'm going to hand it off to Christina Lefevre, the founder and powerhouse of the Pollinator Project Rogue Valley. She has a ton of amazing projects going on. She'll tell you a little bit about that and has a fun activity for you as well. So sharing the host settings with you now.
Oh, good, I can unmute. Hi, everyone. Kristi, that was such a great talk. I learned a lot. Thank you very much. I always enjoy learning from you and hearing all of your good information that you want to share. Hi, everyone. My name is Christina Lefevre, and I'm here representing Pollinator Project Rogue Valley. Thank you, Janine, very much for including us in this talk tonight. Bumblebees are definitely near and dear to my heart, and I'm glad that you're putting this together and that we're going to hear from Bryan in just a second. I'd like to say hello and thank you to one of my board members, Kyle Poling, who I noticed is on the talk, and I see a number of other familiar faces, so thank you so much. Janine, people can also purchase the Bumblebee booklet at our office. So just so you know, we don't have the butterfly guide yet though. So we'll have to fix that, I think. So I'm gonna share my screen, and what I have for you is a quiz. So this doesn't have necessarily to do with bumblebees, but you will see one. I think you can figure that out. So take just a second and tell me, or think to yourself, how many bees do you see? There are 7 winged creatures here. So what number are bees versus wasps, flies, or something else? So I'll give you like 2 more seconds. All right, so Patsy says 3. Betsy says, well, she's not sure. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and go to the second screen, and this will answer your, there you go. So the ones that are dark orange are the bees, and then the others are something different. So number 1 is a hoverfly. This is a fly, also known as syrphid fly or flower fly. I always call it a hoverfly. And if you look closely, you can see the difference between this and a bee's. Fat, stocky, doesn't look very hairy. The eyes are very large. The antennas are short, right in the middle of the face. And then notice how skinny the legs are. This is pretty hairy. It looks kind of like a fly, but it's pretty hairy. The beautiful mason bee in the spring. Here's a bumblebee, sort of, indicative of a common bumblebee. The numid wasp looks pretty waspy. Very good creature to have in your garden. The sand wasp, this looks pretty bee-y to me, but it's actually a sand wasp, and people with sand in their yards and their landscapes, you might actually be lucky enough to see these beautiful creatures. They actually burrow in. North Mountain Park had some a year or 2 ago. I don't know if they're still there. And here's your ubiquitous honeybee. Probably you've seen that in your garden. And then this is a beautiful iridescent sweat bee. So that's just a few of the 500, 600 species of our native bees. The honeybee, as you know, is not a native from Europe, but we have 500, 600 of those. And then I'm just going to put in a little plug for Pollinator Project Rogue Valley. We're based in Phoenix. This is a picture of our garden a month ago, and I'm regretting that I didn't take a picture today. It's actually incredibly gorgeous with the Oregon sunshine, and the penstem and humulus is just about to pop. So it's actually a month makes such a difference. So thank you all very much I hope you enjoyed the little quiz and learned a little bit today on that. And so I'm going to switch now to talk about Bryan, because he's really who you want to hear from. I want to just say I really appreciated what Janine had to say about Bryan. I don't know him very well, but I know he has so much information. And I'm really glad to have him here talking to us tonight. I learned so much from him about native bees versus the honeybees in his Decolonizing Bees talk that he did maybe a month and a half ago. And you can certainly find that out on YouTube. It's called Decolonizing Bees. And I would definitely recommend that. So I'm going to give you his little bio that he submitted to us. Bryan Dykstra is a food farmer on his bee-friendly farm in Humboldt County, California, and also serves as an ethnobotanist for Native Health in Native Hands, a group focused on food sovereignty and traditional ecological knowledge. Bryan has an MS in biology and is the founder of the Native Bee Society. He doesn't say this, but it's on Facebook. So for those of you doing Facebook, I encourage you to join that group and you will see lots of Bryan's amazing photos as well as others. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Bryan and let's hear what he has to say about the native bees of the Cascade-Siskiyous.
Hello, I'm sure everyone can hear me. If you give me a thumbs up. Thank you, Janine. Thank you, Kristi, and thank you for the talk so far. If I drop out for a minute, I'll probably come right back. The worst my internet does is lose it for 1 minute, maybe. So don't worry, hold on. And so I'm going to give a little talk tonight about kind of an introduction to bees in general in the Northern Hemisphere. Might be similar because there's a lot of overlapping genera in different parts of the world, but I will definitely be talking about what's unique in the Klamath-Siskiyou region. And I'm going to share my screen so you can see some of my photos. Thank you for the kind introduction. Here we go. Okay. So my talk is Native Bees of the Cascade-Siskiyou, an introduction. And I took that photo there in Southwest Oregon, where I studied pollination ecology of a rare plant for my master's thesis. And it was 99% pollinated by bumblebees for a lot of the reasons Kristi talked about. Okay. In general, the general public thinks of honeybees when they hear the word bee. We've already heard of a whole bunch of different bumblebee species, as well as the differences between bees and wasps and flies, with our little quiz there. That was a fun quiz. But when we think of honeybees, then from bees, often people are thinking queen bees, colony, honey, stings. Maybe the bees are living in white boxes and swarming. Well, that mental map that we might have really is not the territory. It was really not the landscape. And so our language scape is inadequate. And whether you're learning the common names or the scientific names, just recognizing that there's a lot of native bees out there in the Klamath-Siskiyou region, circled in, approximately red here. It's a wonderful spot where the Sierras and the Sierra Flora and the Cascade Mountains and their flora and fauna kind of meet, where there's also a lot of endemics in the Trinity Alps, the Marble Mountains, the Klamath Mountains, all right there in northwestern California and southwest Oregon. So in Oregon, 500 to 600 species. The species list is going to go up with the bee atlas as it's going on. In California, there's around 1,600 species. And where we overlap has a lot of diversity. For example, if I circle a tiny spot, please recognize that, just so you see it, the blue spot is about 18 miles from me, and in a survey area of less than a seventh, of a square mile, was around 20 some hectares, so very small. 229 species were located within that small area. And those species were co-identified with Robin Thorpe. So it's a good list, as he was a real authority. He'll continue to be for a long time. Rest in peace. So think of that diversity of bees out there as a strength, as an insurance, as an abundance. And, when it comes to flowers coming in every shape, color, size, phenology, elevation, habitat preference, relationship with other plants, and also the diversity of human names for them. Bees are also, great example. They come in every shape, size, and color. They've been recognized as, culturally significant by so many people in so many different ways. And they have so many different habitat requirements and unique biologies. It's really hard to summarize them in 45 minutes, let alone a lifetime. But we're going to think about how all these different things come together here in the Siskiyou and Cascade bioregion. So where they live, what they do, these things can all vary, but what holds them in common? As I mentioned, cultural values are important, and I really like learning about how the Vesper Meadow is taking this approach. And so basically, when you think of that biocultural diversity, a lot of the traditional cultural relationships with the landscape don't just relate to tending plants or rivers. It expands out to all the other life forms. So recognizing the interlinked diversity of nature and culture has included bees and bee habitat. And so a lot of the diversity is an approach. So bees are really, and I'll come back to some cultural elements later, but basically bees are really diverse in color. Here's an example of a green bee, but there's not just one kind of green bee, and there's many kinds of green bee. Here's another on a native Phacelia, and here's another. Here's another. It's not I had to really zoom in on this, very small. So basically, you should also think about how bees can be different in size. Here's a USGS, it's a geological survey, bee inventory and monitoring lab photo, which shows a little bit clearer how beautiful these bees can be when you look close up. And it's hard to tell if this is a bee or wasp until you get some other details down. One of the things is bees love to visit flowers. Male and female bees will visit flowers for nectar. But because they come in such a range of sizes, maybe you thought some were a wasp and some were a gnat, a wasp versus a little fly gnat. Well, here we see a yellow-faced bee on the left and a longhorn bee on the right. They're can be very small, but like Kristi said, lay down, sit down, bring your dog or something. If you have one, be out in nature and hang out with the flowers, and the bees will definitely come to the flowers. But yeah, here's another longhorn bee, an example of size diversity. This is on a California poppy. This is the Haberpoda, but then here's a tiny Halictus. You can see at the bottom of a California poppy, much smaller, almost invisible if she's underneath the anthers. Bees are really important for pollinating native plants, and I'll discuss how this relates to fire, because fire can be beneficial or harmful for plant ecosystems, but it's part of a succession in the ecosystem that we can look at closely. Here's an example of a very small bee on my finger. And here's one that's a little larger on a chicory flower. So one thing that's in common with bees is they eat pollen. you know. So a lot of bees are out there collecting pollen on purpose. And so they have something on their body. All bees, somewhere on their body, will have some branched hairs. This is another USGS photo, as is this one. And those branched hairs, this is from an academic paper here, can be very diverse in shape and size and spacing on the bee's body, length, and how many branches they have on them and how long those branches are. But if you look at a fly or wasp, their hairs would look like mine. It would just be a straight line. Whereas bees, like you see in the picture here, can be branched. And some of them have little spoon-like flat areas at the end of a hair. So sometimes you have to look very close to know which bee you're talking about, because the species are identified by the hair characteristics. But when you see something that has a lot of hair on its body and it's putting that pollen in the hair, that is a real good guess that that is a bee, because bees, most bees will purposefully collect pollen, so that this is part of their life cycle, is to collect pollen to feed their young. So this is a female bee. She's packed some pollen on her hind legs, as you can see there. Flies and most wasps don't push pollen onto their body on purpose. So if you slow down and say, I don't know if it's a bee or wasp, maybe don't look at what it looks like, but look what it's doing. And as a verb, most of the time, if you see a bee on a flower, you know, a female bee, for most bees, she'll be collecting pollen. I mean, it's very likely. If you see that, you know it is a bee. So it is female bees that are doing that. So there's different ways that bees can collect pollen. In different places they put it on their body. On the top are what you would call scopa, or scopae as plural. And that is just basically Italian for broom. So these are very hairy regions that collect pollen, not dust. And those branched hairs sometimes are in the scopae. And when bees put the pollen in there, the pollen hasn't been pressed flat, hasn't been pressed together. So the pollen has a less defined edge, it's rather loose. So then you know you're looking at a group of bees that does not include honeybees or bumblebees. On the bottom, you see honeybees and bumblebees. If they collect pollen, they collect it in what's called a pollen basket. So this is a smooth, kind of concave area with long, unbranched hairs on the side that function like the side walls of a basket. And they press the pollen in one of their knees. It's called the bee's knees, right? Height of excellence, super cute. But they will mix nectar and press it really tight. And then what happens then, sorry, I got a PDF suddenly downloaded. Okay, I hope you can see my screen. The pollen baskets then have pollen that has been pressed tight. Sometimes the pollen grains even break, and it has more of a clear defined edge. So here you see the corbicula. A corbicula is Greek for very tiny agricultural gathering basket. And so that is to scale there. That's how tiny it is. See the gnome? Okay. So here is a bumblebee, and she has a very smooth concave region on her hind leg with long hairs on the edge. That is the pollen basket. That is the corbicula. You can see it from the rear of her as well. Here's a bumblebee, and she is not collecting pollen here. The pollen here is yellow, but she's already filled up her pollen baskets with blue pollen. Here's a honeybee who has just begun packing pollen into her corbicula. Again, this is a basket on her leg. On the other hand, here's another wonderful in focus USGS photo. A scopa has that loose look feeling on the hind leg. As you see here, the pollen grains are there, right there. And as you've seen this one, right there. And this one, I held the flower still in the wind so I could get a good picture of the bee with the pollen on her legs. This bee hasn't collected a bunch of pollen, but I could see her hairy hind legs. Okay, other bees, and this is all in a single family. Most bees in this family will collect pollen and put it on the bottom of their belly. If you were looking close, you can see the yellow here. Maybe there's an arrow right there. There's the pollen on the bottom of this leafcutter bee. This is a native leafcutter bee. Here's one that I've got in my hand. You can see on my thumb, she has hair on the bottom of her abdomen. She's in the genus Mergenthaler. There are also bees that do not collect pollen purposefully on the outside of their body for transport back to their nest. Rather, they keep the pollen in their crop, so they ingest it and then they regurgitate it later along with the nectar. And some of these bees are called yellow-face bees because they tend to have yellow-face markings, although other bees do have those too. This is in the genus Hylaeus. We have, those are very small typically. And then we have other bees that don't collect pollen on the outside of their bodies, and they don't collect it in their crop. In fact, these bees don't collect pollen at all. So like a bird that doesn't collect any worms for her babies, these are cuckoo bees. Like a cuckoo bird will lay an egg in another bird's nest and say, goodbye, have fun being raised by a different mom. And these bees do that. They fly into the nest of a different bee, and sometimes they're very host specific. And they sneak in, lay an egg in there, and when the egg hatches, it could eat the pollen provisions, and sometimes it'll take a bite off the other egg or larva to ensure it's the one to get the pollen and nectar provisions set aside for the other species. And there's a whole bunch of different genera that do this. There's a fair number of species that are like this, that look can look pretty wasp-like. And you won't see them collect pollen on purpose. But over time, you can become familiar with what these look like and their hosts as well. So here's another example. This is a Trapeolus. My photos are blurry of this one, but I've seen. Okay, but this is one of my better ones of the cuckoo bees. This is a nomada. So there you go, in the subgenus Holonomada. Okay, so those kleptoparasites, a nest parasite bees, they're looking for nests. And if we go looking for nests, we can think about how the majority of bees out there actually nest underground. And we don't really, don't think of a bunch of bees pouring out of a hole in the ground, because most bees are solitary bees. That means they're single hardworking moms. Maybe they live in like an aggregation, so they have neighbors nearby, whether it's a centimeter, a foot, or 50 feet apart. But each nest would have one mother bee that's bringing back pollen and nectar for her babies. So if she comes and goes 10 times a day, you have to be patient. Wait, don't blink 10 times during the day to see her go in that hole. So maybe you thought it was an abandoned ant hole, or that's the worm house, but that might be bee nesting habitat. And here you can see some of the mounds pushed up by bees in this area. And bees, a lot of bee species like the open bare ground, not shade for their nesting habitat. Not all, but most. So here's a bee. I took a picture of this one on the coastal dunes here in northwestern California, and she's digging a hole. These can be more than a meter deep in this species. So bees sometimes are, 4 inches underground, and sometimes they're, more than a few feet underground. There's her hole underneath a coastal artemisia. This is a bee coming back to a nest. And can you see the antenna of the bee waiting there? This is Halictus farinosus, I think. Either way, this is a social Halictus species. Not every native bee species is solitary. Bumbles are very eusocial. There's a clear, for most of those species, but there are also social bee species outside of bumblebees. And these are one of this species, depending on the climate, the weather, and the location in the United States, sometimes these bees will act social. So there'll be multiple sisters assisting a mother, and one might guard the entrance and others might be out foraging for pollen and nectar, but only one would be laying eggs. And so there's a lot of gray area between solitary and social. It's not a clear-cut distinction every time. Okay. Here is a ego. Oh, I spelled that wrong. There's a T in there. Eggopostamon. I found these holes, and somebody's just got to peer in there with a flashlight and say, "Oh, there they are." He's waiting to come out for the daytime. So here is a great ground nesting bee, Diadasia bituberculata, that we can find in our ecoregion, as well as Southern California. Ours emerged later than those in Southern California. And you can see she's carrying pollen on her legs. She nests underground, but she also makes something above ground. The Diadasias tend to make a chimney that they create above ground too. It's thought to either deter predators, make it harder for them to get in there, also temperature regulation. There's a penny for size for a smaller species that was nesting there as well. And sometimes these tubes can be a few inches long, coming up out of the ground or sideways. There she is, she's starting to build one. This is the Diadasia dimutina. There we go, okay. And then I found some of those nests that had been plugged up with pine resin. And I'm like, well, these bees don't use pine resin. And I started reading some of the literature, and I found out that, oh, Osmia, this is a mason bee that actually uses resin from pine trees, is known to take over old nests of this small Diadasia, the small chimney bee. This small chimney bee is thought to be a specialist on one of our Sedelcias. And I'll talk about what that means to be a specialist on a flower later. But often these nests underground they're great foraging areas for animals like skunks. This is on my farm. All the Halictus nests are real fair game for the skunks. They dig down trying to find. You can see that's 6-7 inches down, and that hole's still going. The guard bee obviously couldn't keep the skunk away, but I bet there's safe children under there. And in areas that I till, I have areas I have no till, but even in areas I till, I know that there's a lot of bees that aren't bothered by that top 6 inches of disturbance. This bee would be bothered by that. This is a bee that makes a chimney as well, but these nest in vertical faces of clayey soil. This is Anthophora bomboides. It's looks like a bumblebee, but it's not, because it has those pollen brooms on its hind leg. Otherwise, it really looks like a bumblebee. Bees also use a variety of materials other than soil or resin for their nests. This is a leaf cutter bee. It specifically uses one kind of leaf and for its nest. Here's some more examples of leaf cutter bees. They make these circles and ovals they use to wrap like a straw, and they use that straw of protection over their pollen provisions, their nectar and pollen provisions, and the eggs they lay. And often they're making choices here. Often they're making choices to choose the plants that are native. Native bees that are leafcutter bees prefer native plants, and non-native leafcutter bees that have been introduced to the United States and are sold widely tend to prefer non-native plants for that. Either way, they both choose plants that tend to have these antibiotic and water repellent properties. If you're familiar with the Pacific madrone, there's a large one. It's hundreds of years old here on the farm, and it not this year, but in previous, this is a great year for madrone flowers, but in previous years, it really had a lot of the leaf blight. And so the leaves were falling off the madrone tree. And my daughter found this bee nest was attached to the leaf. Now this is leaf pieces that have been macerated up and into a protective covering over the pollen and nectar provision. So this bee was counting on that leaf staying up in the way upper canopy, but it fell, and so it broke like that. Bees will also use petals for their nest because, well, say the whole Onagraceae family, their petals tend to have this kind of very fine structure that repels water. It beads up, which is why like fireweed has been used to waterproof petals, have been used to, they are traditionally used for waterproofing baskets by some tribes. Well, the bees will use the petals to make their nests. This is on the farm here. I started planting a native farewell to spring and some other native Clarkias, and boom, I had a real increase of this leaf cutter bee. And when I was harvesting garlic, I found that some of the leaf and petal pieces had been in a nest. This was just the top couple inches. There's one cell that would have held one baby bee that was already not there, but I didn't dig any deeper. And I found that they were nesting in my cardoon stems on the left, and I did not do the X-ray on the right. That's from an academic paper on Megachile montevega that uses the Clarkia petals and will nest underground and in thistle stems. And I said, well, I think that's what I have. I'm not going to collect a specimen, but I'll keep trying to get photos of the actual bee, which I haven't been able to do. They're very fast. But yeah, they'll make a hole in a live stem and provision for their babies in there using flower petals. So I want to recommend a book now at this point. This is the book. I'm going to come back to it later if you haven't written it down. I'll also get it in the chat later. Solitary Wasps and Bees, Their Hidden World in the Siskiyou Mountains by Mary Petzold. She was a real environmental activist. She worked in Southwest Oregon collecting pollen for research. And she is what I call like just an amazing naturalist. She spent the time, she was patient, and she didn't blink for 10 hours straight, probably, to see those bees coming back to the nest or wasps, like, really to know as individuals what they're doing. And that's really how we understand what species do. And you can order it, they print it when you order it at lulu.com. I think that's the only place, unless you were lucky to find it in a bookstore, which means someone else really wanted it and then doesn't have it anymore, I guess. But you can order it there. I just recommend it because here's one sample page from that. Lots of great text and lots of great watercolor paintings. This is a native leaf cutter bee collecting Clarkia petals and bringing them back to her nest. Now, you see this bee? You can tell it's a carpenter bee, right? Because it has its tools on a tool belt. Well, not really. It's not really. This is a male carpenter bee, so we know that he doesn't really do much work anyways. So this is the female carpenter bee, and where does she nest? She doesn't use flower petals. But she nests in wood, and you can see her scopa on her legs, her hind legs there. She looks a little bit like a bumblebee, but more important than looking at her abdomen and whether it's shiny or fuzzy, look at those legs, but that combo, the shiny black hairless abdomen, relatively hairless, and those hairy legs, mean that this isn't a bumblebee. This is Xylocopa. And so here's some photos. They'll go any wood, it doesn't matter, poplar, oak, redwood, pine, Doug fir, madrone. They'll excavate holes anywhere between a centimeter wide or so. There's one concentrating nectar to make a nectar pollen provision for her baby. She's just using her mouth to expose the nectar to the air. And here's an X-ray, and I didn't do the X-ray, but of like their nest, and they'll sometimes overwinter, so they can live more than 1 year. sometimes a daughter will say, oh, I was born this year, I'm just gonna watch what my mom does and clean up around the house, and I'm not gonna have any children this year, or maybe next year. So they can have, you know, a long life. And this is an example of one of the bees that people regularly encounter in our area because they nest in untreated, you know, unpainted, unvarnished wood. Well, of course, they also like that wood because it's dead, it's not alive. And where do we allow dead wood these days? In the forest or in our parks? Where do we allow it? Here we go. There's a small carpenter bee, and it likes to nest in pithy stems. So it excavates pith. Its mandibles can't really excavate wood. So we call it a tiny carpenter bee. So I rescued this out of someone's yard compost. They threw all their old blackberry stems, and I got a bunch of tiny carpenter bees. You see that? And then so then I have to put them somewhere. That's the bee in there. And there's a lot going on in this photo, but here's some of the stems that I collected, as well as some grass stems I threw in there. The carpenter bees on the left are excavating pith. And then the other ones that are plugged with mud, that's one is a bee and one is a wasp that uses mud to nest in small cavities. But the carpenter bees were excavating the pith. But outside nesting, we can think about what bees go to and what that means for phenology. I want to talk about phenology. Here's a calypso orchid, beautiful if you find a shadier area in the forest. They don't typically find, you can't typically find them in large stands or anything, but these are pollinated by queen bumblebees. They're nectarless, they have no nectar. Their pollen is not accessible for the bumblebee to bring back to her nest. But bumblebee queens come out at the right time and are the right size to pollinate the orchid. And so they go from orchid to orchid saying, well, one of these beautiful things must have something for me. They're too beautiful. Yeah. But a honeybee wouldn't really be visiting these because they are in these really small patches. The honeybee is the wrong size to get the pollinia on her. And there's no nectar and no pollen, so she would never visit again. And even if she shouldn't be pollinating it because she's the wrong size. So here's an example of things that would be blooming later in the year, right? You can see there's stuff that's blooming in many months of the year, outside of these even. And some produce pollen, some produce nectar, some produce both. Some bees can get the pollen from some of those. Some bees can get the nectar, some can get both. So it could really be a fifth dimensional chart if you wanted it to be. If we just overlay like our Bombus Franklini over that, the males would be looking for nectar later in the year. The queens are looking first, and soon they have their workers. This is what their schedule would be. This is just one species that different genders and different members of the species are active at different times of year. And so a lot of our native flora have these relationships with native plants. Here's the males are out later, as an example. So I want to talk about male bees because we can't. We talk a lot about female bees and what they're doing. Now, you've probably heard of mycopollen, and why not? Maybe we're being controlled by plants, or maybe we're being controlled by bees. Maybe we're being controlled by specific plants or specific bees. Anyways, mycopollen wrote about how the male bumblebee was being controlled by the apple tree. Although male bumblebees aren't out when that is happening, but he says the bee has no idea that it's picked up pollen. This is from the movie. And here's the book. A bumblebee would probably also regard himself as a subject in the garden. So almost working as an analogy, but basically, even in these type of books, sometimes we're given the wrong idea about bees. Male bees are usually out later because then they're going to mate with a female. Well, I mean, for male bumblebees are usually out later. Okay. Here we go. And male bees don't collect pollen. And if you did see a bee on an apple blossom, she would definitely be collecting pollen on purpose typically. But the pollen jocks in the bee movie, which a lot of kids have seen, a lot of adults have seen it. They go and collect pollen with these guns and then shoot it at flowers or bring it back. Not sure. That's not real. They don't do the work. It's female bees visiting the flowers that get a lot of work done. And in fact, I want to say something about traditional ecological management as it relates to caring for bees, because low intensity fires to enhance the vegetative diversity really helps the native bees come back. These low intensity fires, they definitely destroy some small like nesting above ground habitat, but it also creates some as well. But usually it's not getting those bees beneath the ground. So there's some studies that show even intense fires can help, because we have so much kind of conifer intrusion into what were traditionally more open and oak woodlands with more bulb forming plants and stuff. That creating more open space, creating more dead wood can enhance the bee abundance and diversity. But there's a balance there, because those high intensity fires can go low enough to kill some bees, and it also can decrease in the moment the number of cavity nesting spaces, as a lot of smaller twigs and grasses are burned. So here's a wasp, Syntexis libocedri. This is the incense cedar wood boring wasp. It's known to find still smoldering incense cedars to lay eggs into, which then its eggs will hatch and the larva will burrow. It's a vegetarian wasp, so its larvae are chewing through the wood in there, and it creates new cavities for cavity nesting bees, and the ones that can last a long time when these trees are not quote unquote salvaged. But then after a fire, there's that more open space that a lot of plants can bounce back in high abundance and enjoy the sunshine. There's less competition for sunshine, and so there's more floral diversity, especially and most importantly, when there's a seed bank of native plants that it's not already been filled with English ivy and star thistle or so. Back to Mary Petzel's book, she's got a wasp in there that she drew, bringing a spider larger than herself. Now wasps, because they don't have those branched hairs, they're typically not adapted to getting pollen, but some of them are very specific. They're also mostly single hardworking moms, but a lot of them are very specific on what they'll collect. Maybe just queen ants, so only a certain time of year. They only feed their babies queen ants, or some of them only feed them, like certain groups of spiders, or only aphids. So bees, when they evolved and diversified to utilize pollen and nectar, they also some of them became very specific on what food they eat. So here's a wasps that are very specific in how they build nests. So bees became also adapted, in unique niches to the nesting habitat and what they feed on. So here's that book again. I recommend it. Those are all the pictures from the book. There's a lot more in there. Okay, so for example, here's one bee that we can find in her area. Now it only visits members of the squash family. In Central California, I know it visits some native squashes. Here, it's come up, there's a species that only visits our cultivated squash. So far, people need to do more observations. You can see she looks like a honeybee, but she's got pollen on her scopae, very loose. Okay, but some of the bees that are very specific are listed here, but there's so many. I gave a couple examples. For example, the species epithet of Osmia pentstemon. Guess what? It only feeds its babies penstemon pollen. Duphoria dentipes specializes on visiting Calicortus. Osmia pykei visits ribes specifically, and on and on. And some plants, to summarize, to make it simpler, some plants, there's a whole bunch of plants that have oligolectic bees. Sure, a honeybee will visit strawberry or manzanita, or buttercup or any of these here, but will she every year? Will she, if in diversity is strength, and there's a lot of bees that are better at pollinating than honeybees and will never give up on their plant as long as it's there, and they help keep it there because they're the best pollinator for it. This is the example of this is the diadasia that makes the turrets, the little chimneys. It specializes, it's on a native morning glory, not the invasive bindweed. And so here's one. This morning glory, I was up early trying to get it, get some photos. It was still closed in this diadasia, and there's non-native plants. There's less of this plant than there used to be in the area I was because of like off-roaders and stuff. Well, so she was like, really like, I got to find an open flower. She probably didn't find one because see those holes in the petals? She made those. It was all folded up, closed. You know how morning glories are closed. And she used her mandibles and cut the holes in there until it unfolded itself. And then she climbed in. I have a video, but I can't do videos on the PowerPoint with my technology. But go out and look for the native, look up a map of where the native Calistigias are and hang out. You could maybe see this bee. Maybe you'll find this nesting habitat. It's usually not far away. Then maybe you'll find this is an area worth preserving. But there are other bees that, maybe what they visit isn't necessarily because they only have that pollen, but because of their time of year, as I mentioned, like with the bumblebees. This is an Andrena visiting a wild plum. And that's a male bee too. So males have the unique biologies. This is a USGS photo. This is the antenna of a male showing unique showy adaptations with the little spatulas at the end. They have an extra flagellum compared to females, but that usually takes a very good photo or microscope to see. This is a mating Xylocopa. You can see the female on the left below and the male on the right. Depending on the species of Xylocopa, the males can look very different than females. So sometimes it's the same species, but looking very different. Like some birds you might think of, males and females may look so different. You have to learn that, they're the same species. This is a male, so he doesn't have big pollen carrying legs, but very pretty. This is the Agapostemon. Okay. Doing the time here. Okay, I'll finish up by 8 here, right? This is a male in the tribe Eucerini. These are longhorn bees. They use those long antennae to stroke the eyes and antenna of females in courtship. So the whole mating and process is unique for each species. You think of bird songs and what males do to impress the females. There's the equivalent in the bee world. That's cool to see. And males, of course, as it's been pointed out earlier this evening, they don't have stingers. Stingers are modified wasp ovipositors, so they're modified egg-laying devices. So males don't have them. And here's this is good enough to count an extra flagellum on the male. And a lot of them have like a nice mustache or a nice white or clear clypeus like this one. It's protruding. This is the area above the mouth, between the eyes, below the antenna. Here is nice and fuzzy. An extra long antenna. Okay, and they have some behaviors where they usually don't rest underground in the female's nest because she's the female's not like you're not doing anything else for me now. So they'll sleep at night sometimes attached to leaves or grasses like this one here. I took in Oregon. This one here, all the male Andrenas were sleeping in the same place. This is Andrena cerasifolii. This is a bee that has 2 generations in a year where I live. And it's a really pretty metallic blue that you can't really tell in this photo, but this is also in our area. This is Melisodes, more longhorn bees, and all the males sleeping together on a seed head, waiting for the dawn to crack, I guess. Some bees have, like a lot of competition for the females. These are multiple males flying in from the right here to try to engage with the female who's already mating a male there. But males have a relatively short life for most bees, so that's why you usually don't see them on flowers, because they don't die in mating like honeybees. But they typically, they'll mate multiple times, but usually it's a female who's got much more work to do, so she's going to live a lot longer. Okay. To wrap up, I'm going to talk about some of the issues facing our native bees and talk about one that has become more in the news in scientific research. These are honeybees and native bees right here on the sunflower. And I've seen the honeybees taking pollen off the native bees because they're like, oh, that's easy. You already put it together for me. I've seen them knocking them off flowers. They do that, they steal from each other. They do steal from other bees as well. And there's more and more research on their impacts on native bees. So this is camas. I know Vesper Meadow has got that great camas meadow. And I took this nice blurry photo of a honeybee basically stealing nectar. And this one, she's basically stealing nectar again. And with the floral faces of camas and the way honeybees collect nectar and the way they collect pollen and the times they do it, I can tell that, well, they're probably not pollinating it. And there's someone who's been doing research on that at UC Davis, Maureen Page, and her preliminary results are that if you introduce honeybees to a camas field that didn't have them before, the seed set will go down in camas as a result, because the resources are gone for the native bees who have that co-evolved relationship to pollinate it well for tens of thousands, more than tens of thousands of years, and so that can be problematic. So here's a little write-up by Kathy Keatley Garvey on the blog below, in which she discusses Maureen Page's research, basically that honeybees are ineffective pollinators of camas, and when native bee visits are replaced by honeybees, it reduces seed set. And this is one example of many. Here's a picture I took of a bumblebee on camas. She's doing a great job pollinating it, and the research shows that. But there's more studies on competition that I could get into. Basically, we artificially increase the number of honeybees by feeding them sugar water, giving them pollen patties, breeding processes, purchase commercial production, and they don't have their colony build up to match the floral resources. And then they go to more and more plants that they're not great pollinators of, or that aren't good enough for them. And that can also make them sick, and they can pass on diseases to native plants. And we build up these large number of colonies as a society so that we can pollinate agricultural crops that don't have that habitat for native bees. So the most effective pollinators, without the place to live, can't pollinate the farms in that way. So then we bring in, just like we're bringing water down to almonds in California from Oregon and from Northern California to deal with how we grow almonds, we bring in honeybees. And then what do we do with those honeybees the rest of the year? They are brought to wildlands where, so it's really like the almond orchards relationship with honeybees is causing the pollen and nectar extraction out of our wild areas. Now honeybees are great pollinators of non-native plants. I've seen beekeeping organizations defend star thistle from eradication because it makes great honey. This is great research by the USDA, in which you can watch a video about it too. It's some information there, so you can watch a recording, maybe pause it later. But every 100 hives removes pollen and nectar enough to produce 10 million native bees. Now think about each one of those bees being more effective at pollinating the diversity of native plants, and realize how these ecosystem shifts toward non-native plants happens. Because that's a lot of resource extraction. And plants do not produce unlimited amount. Just like plants are disappearing, the pollen and nectar of each individual plant can disappear, and it's sad. So people like to say raising honeybees to save pollinators is like raising cows to help ungulates, right? Or we think of the bison and we think of the cow. They do different things. They have different dietary preferences. And they have different longstanding relationships with the land. They're not equivalent. One, we have, what kind of relationship do we have with the cow or the honeybee? And how do we think about them when it relates to them being on wild lands? Well, we think of environmental groups like the Sierra Club. He first president, not president, but that's okay. I do my own spell checks, Well, John Muir, he really gave advice about like how to establish bee ranches. And he said, California is basically a vast bee pasture for honeybees. And, he was not exactly an environmentalist that was inclusive of the indigenous inhabitants. He was like, oh, we got to have a park, but we don't want any Native Americans there. That's something the Sierra Club has looked at now. They have some blog post about like how maybe John Muir wasn't the best example of conservation in action. But he did call honeybees sweet-winged cattle, and for that I think he was probably right. And now the Sierra Club today is still saying, like honeybees are endangered. Oh, I don't know who's running their Twitter, but that's not true. Maybe we treat them poorly and they get sick and they're causing problems for other bees. But you could still adopt a honeybee from the Sierra Club. These are cattle, folks. Maybe this is a bad idea. So I really give kudos and respect for Vesper Meadows' decisions on that. One more example for birds, chickens and honeybees versus our native birds and native bees. In Hawaii, the yellow-faced bees are 7 of them. 7 species are listed as endangered. Honeybees, the native bees are known to not visit flowers that honeybees are visiting. Just like the native birds are less likely to visit a nectar producing plant that they need when honeybees are on it. So we have to think about those relationships. When you go out there and you're out there, how do I identify this bee? I really say, we're in a stage where, digital online resources, maybe you don't need a net, maybe you just need a camera and the internet. It's really helpful and it's a great way to learn without killing bees in the meantime, as people do kill bees to identify them with a microscope. But you can become familiar with identifying a whole variety of bees by taking good quality photographs and thinking about the anatomy. Everything in here could be slightly longer, protruding a little different, a little denser hair or less. And so it's a very nuanced taxonomy of stuff that's very small. So don't rush into it, just enjoy them for what they are and become familiar. If you've seen dandelion 100 times, then maybe you'll know when it's not a dandelion. When you've seen dandelion at different times of year, maybe then you'll know, you just start learning how it's different than other similar plants. So take your time with learning the taxonomy of bees. This is something from, you can get a whole great set of resources from the Encyclopedia of Life online. You see there the observer cards, and they get into a lot of stuff I do, but with, all the, you can read it, print it as a PDF or whatever. The idea is that, sometimes how do you know it's one genus versus another from your photo? Well, maybe you need to have a good enough photo to look at the little wavy lines in the wings. And that can be difficult, but honestly, some of my fuzzier photos maybe still had this visible. So it was like still possible for someone else to say, oh, no, it's Haverpoda because, your middle marginal cell, et cetera. So one thing I've used before is I've modified a honeybee queen catcher. I glued on a little tiny screen, and then I catch a bee in that, and then I can look at it. And some of you doing the bumblebee surveys might do that and take photos. Anyways, I was able to identify the genus of this, and then I know all about, there's so much to learn just from the genus. It's like, if you know the difference between Rosa and Mentha, the difference between rose and a mint, a whole bunch, where they might like to grow, what time of year they might flower, so much. And so learning even just the genus or the family of a bee, you might learn what it likes to pollinate, what it might need for nesting habitat. And maybe you don't have a species for it, but it's still a beautiful thing. Anyways, I want to say thank you for your time. enjoy some photos of bees. If you want to write me, you can email me, nativebeesociety@gmail.com. And I can stop the screen share because I think we're going to do some questions and answers. And I just appreciate you all being here, and have fun looking for bumblebees and looking for the other bees.
Wow, I just learned so much. Can people hear me?
And
Okay. So yeah, thanks to both our speakers. Thank you, Bryan, for preparing all of that. We have a couple questions from earlier, some from Vanessa that were answered by Kristi. So y'all can scroll up for those. Vanessa's no longer here anyhow. But I have one question from Kyle, who asks, when packing pollen, does a female bee always groom the pollen from the body into a tight sac, or do they sometimes purposely harvest the pollen during their trip? See if we can unmute Bryan.
Maybe I'm unmuted. Hi. Okay.
Oh,
yeah.
you are unmuted.
All right. Thanks for your question. It really depends on the bee species. There are some bees that like to do it in flight, and I think it also depends on the weather and how that bee is feeling. You know, some bees might say, you know, right now I have the time to stay here on the flower. They have like their elbows, and since bees have a lot of leg segments, they have like more than one knee or elbow, but they have an antenna cleaner, so they can squeeze it and it fits right on the antenna, you know, and they can pull the pollen that's on their antenna off, and that really helps because their antenna are really sensitive to, you know, all kinds of volatile organic compounds. You know, bees can tell, you know, how much pollen or nectar might be at a flower. So sometimes you go like, why are they just doing this? Now, I still don't know why ants are doing the things they do always, but I have a better idea now why bees are doing these. So why don't you just go ahead and land? Well, they're both assessing the danger from predators. They're assessing which flower has the right pollen and nectar for them. You know, there's a lot I've seen. The bees are so smart. So you think of like how they might be putting the pollen on their body. There are bees that collect pollen on their forehead and then they move it onto their abdomen. You know, there's a lot of different ways that they collect pollen. In fact, one time I saw a bee following another one. It was probably one that was like 3-4 millimeters long, following one that was more like almost a centimeter big. And the big one was opening these little legume petals of like I think it was a clover. It was Mealy lotus, and so it's a legume that when the bee visits, it makes the pollen accessible. If you're not big enough as a bee, you can't break in to get the pollen. So this bigger bee was going in, getting the pollen and nectar, and going to the next flower, trailing behind it every exact flower across the whole yard into the neighbor's yard. I went in the neighbor's yard. You know, the little bee was going to the same flower right after because it was open. This little bee obviously wasn't going to be able to open, to push down the keel and get the pollen, but there's always a little left over for her. So, you know, the bees are really smart. They memorize all kinds of locations about where and assess like, oh, there might be more pollen available in like 3 days. So I'll probably come back in 3 days. You know, they're always thinking these things. That's why mathematicians have like bee algorithms based on, you know, how smart bees are. Not that they're really based on about bees, but yeah, you know, they're smart.
Wow. Well, one more question for you, Bryan, actually came from Kristi.
Yeah.
And have you seen any research on impacts to bees from spring prescribed burns when it's kind of a not normal time for natural wildfires, but something we've been seeing more and more?
I don't know of that. I think it's worth looking into. And I think every season in every location would be different than any other location in any given season. Sometimes you don't know what's in the seed bank, sometimes you don't know every bee that might be nesting there. I have seen some restoration work where they looked at flamethrowers and they tried to measure the heat at what depth, so are they killing the weed seeds, but are they killing the bees? And so I think it's really hard to judge with a prescribed fire, maybe what the heat might be in some places, and make the analogy work somewhere else is what I mean, because I think people do have, there's some science behind that, but I don't know how often that's applied for a prescribed burn, like, oh, well, how deep is the burn going to go? I think it's more like perimeters, but maybe if we pay more attention to all the various details before, being confident, even saying we don't know what's going to happen, but let's try to measure it before and after. It's a good question that I don't know. I do know some of the heavy fires can go deep enough to get a lot of bees, so that fuel buildup can be dangerous. And a lot of our Northwest California, Southwest Oregon ecosystem had larger areas that were, the prescribed fire, traditional fire was outlawed, and so I think, which is good for camas. There's research show that fire is good for camas, is good for Dicoylostema and Calochortus and, Manzanita and all these things that the bees love. So I think we should be really careful with how we do fire, but recognize that, that's part of the continuum in our bioregion, being really smart about it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That's why it's really good to be conducting all these community-powered surveys at Vesper Meadow, kind of in conjunction with the restoration work that we're doing. One last very simple question, simple answer maybe from Samantha, is that, does anyone know the name of that child's toy that was used to capture bees? I think Robin Thorpe had a toy that he was maybe sucking up bees with. Kristi, do you know? I do know the Nature Shop has this German toy called a Snappy, and maybe not as good for flying insects, but if you want to capture other walking insects, you put it over the insect and it has a little piece that slides under, and then you can examine it.
Sadly, I do not know the name, although I think they're pretty common and they are toys that are supposed to be pollinator toys. But good luck.
You might be able to call up the Nature Shop in Ashland.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question. If anyone else has questions, I encourage you to send them to me by email in response to the follow-up email that I'll have. And then we'll make sure to get you an answer. So one final question from Ken is, are bumblebee houses a thing? What's the best way to create bumblebee nesting habitat?
Yes, that's a great question. Most bumblebee houses are not that successful. Some of our bumblebee species, most of our bumblebee species tend to nest underground, but some do nest up, including in trees or in birdhouses. I think so far it's pretty tricky, but occasionally people are very lucky and do have bumblebees use those bumblebee houses. The best thing for bumblebees is natural habitats. And in terms of nesting, often bumblebee queens like to pick rodent holes. They like to pick places under bunch grasses, logs, leaving woody debris around. Those are all excellent things, but good question. I too would like to have a bumblebee nest box, but overall, I don't think they're very successful.
Well, big thanks to everyone.
And it looks like we have a bug catcher.
Oh, yep. Yep. Thanks, Jen. Thank you again, everyone. I'll follow up by email. I hope to see you next week at this time to talk about butterflies and later this summer to explore at Vesper Meadow. Have a good night.